Mr. Book was born in 1966 in Toronto, and besides his job as a professor in creative writing, literature and poetry, he makes poetry. And I say make because Mr. Buck uses more than words to create his poems. Welcome, Mr. Buck.
That's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming out. I'm grateful for your presence.
Do I pronounce your name right, by the way?
My last name is pronounced Book,
Book.
B-O-O-K. My birth name is, in fact, B-O-O-K. But to avoid the indignity of having that as my last name while being a poet, I respelled it B-O-K with the umlaut over the O to disguise it. So when people ask me, are you the Christian Book? I have to say, no, that's the Bible. I used to get a lot of Bible jokes when I was a kid, and I really had to change my name in order to, evade some of that bullying, right?
Okay, so I pronounce Book.
Book, just like something you read.
Okay,
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Book, just before I left home, I told my sons, who are real fanatic Lego players, that I was going to interview a man that could make a poem out of Lego. And they laughed real hard, and they said that was impossible. But you did, right?
Yes.
And
back in the
how
early,
did you get that idea?
Back in the early aughts, 2001 or 2002, I was invited to build an artwork for a group show in New York City. It was my very first art show.
Art show, you say, right?
It was an art show, yes, an art exhibit in New York. And for that commission, I built a book made entirely out of Lego bricks. No piece of Lego in it was bigger than a 2x2 pegged tile, made out of about 8,000. Yeah, it was a bit like the tiniest granular bits of Lego, the most atomistic bits of Lego, arranged and conceived into a book in which the text, the pages, the binding, everything was made entirely from Lego. You could actually, manipulate it like you would any other book. You could open the pages, and each page had a single line of poetry arranged as a kind of mosaic upon the page. And the poem consisted of 10 lines of poetry, each of which was an anagram of the title. The title was 10 Maps of Sardonic Wit. And
why that line?
The book consisted of 10 pages. Each page had a single line of poetry, and every line was a permutation of that title, 10 Maps of Sardonic Wit. So the opening line would be, atoms in space now drift. And then the second line would be, on a swift and epic storm. And those two lines are a perfect anagram of the title. They have exactly the same letters in the title, just rearranged. So the book itself was a poem about the relationship between atoms and letters. They're both recombinatory. You can recombine them into new forms.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear between...
Atoms and letters.
Oh, okay, yeah,
right?
atoms.
There's an atomistic dimension to this work. You can pull apart the letters of the poem and rearrange them, just as you could pull apart the letters, the components of the book, and rearrange them into something new. I sold that work for $10,000 to Takashi Murakami, one of the world's greatest pop artists, and it made my reputation as a conceptual artist at the time. I was
not as a poet, more as an artist.
Well, I participated in that show as a poet, but I recognized that it would be lovely to be an artist. It was a very glamorous experience, being in the art world.
Far
more glamorous than being a poet, let me tell you. I mean, I got to shake hands with Robert De Niro and Hilary Swank, like real celebrities.
So now I'm one handshake away from Robert De Niro as well.
Well, it's been a while.
Nevertheless.
In response to that, I was then subsequently asked to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the invention of Lego by producing a commission. And I found, believe it or not, an extraordinary coincidence in the Library of Babel. I was asked to respond to the Lego patent, and I took from the patent a paragraph in which Gottfried Kirk Christensen, the inventor of Lego, defines a Lego brick. And that paragraph, a very short paragraph, I juxtaposed with a paragraph taken from a work by Democritus called The Great Order of the Universe, in which Democritus defines an atom. And I found a paragraph from that work in which he defines the atom, and just simply juxtaposed it with this definition of a Lego brick from the original patent. And what is uncanny or remarkable about these two texts is that they are perfect anagrams of each other. All of the letters that appear in the text by Democritus appear in the text by Gottfried Christensen. It's an uncanny coincidence that I felt quite blessed to have discovered. It was an amazing accident and an extraordinary magic trick. I thought at the time I must be one of the greatest poets alive because the cosmos has endorsed my genius simply by allowing me to notice the relationship between these two paragraphs.
But you also like to puzzle. That's what I think when I hear you
do.
talking.
I like to write poetry that's a puzzle. It's true.
Because, speaking about puzzling, brings us to one of the works you will be reading this festival, excerpts from Eunonia.
Yes, Eunonia. Eunonia is the shortest word.
Can I?
Yeah, be my guest. I'm sorry.
Can I just first ask you to read one of them?
Oh yeah, sure. I'd be delighted.
Do you know them by heart or no?
No, unfortunately, I don't commit my poetry to memory. Time and alcohol have begun to take their toll upon me, right? Yeah.
I only have a few, and don't mind.
Sure.
Mind my handwriting. I don't know which one you like most.
Okay, I'm gonna read a little bit from these works later, but I'll read from
just one
from chapter O for Yoko Ono, and this work is written according to a Herculean constraint. It's a really difficult form of poetry to write. So this is from chapter O for Yoko Ono. Loops on bold fonts now form lots of words for books. Books form cocoons of comfort, tombs to hold bookworms. Profs from Oxford show frosh who do postdocs how to gloss works of Wordsworth. Dons who work for proctors or provosts do not fob off school to work on crosswords, nor do dons go off to dorm rooms to loll on cots. Dons go cross town to look for bookshops, known to stock lots of top-notch goods, cookbooks, workbooks, room on room of how-to books for jocks, how to jog, how to box, books on pro sports, golf or polo, old colophons on school books from schoolrooms sport two sorts of logo, oblong whorls, rococo scrolls, both on worn Morocco.
Thank you. Maybe you already noticed that this poem has only words with an O in it. And so Mr. Book also wrote poems with only an A in it, and only an E, and only an I, and only a U. How many of these poems in totally did you write for this book, Eunonia, which a word that consists of all vocals?
Sure. The word Eunoia, spelled E-U-N-O-I-A, is the shortest word in English to contain all the vowels. It means quite literally beautiful thinking.
Yeah.
The word was coined by Aristotle to describe the state of mind that you must be in if you want to make a friend. You have to be in a state of goodwill. And of course in Greek, good means beautiful and will means thinking. It's a word that means quite literally beautiful thinking. It's a great metaphor for poetry. The work is written in 5 chapters, each of which tells a meaningful story, but does so using only one of the 5 vowels. So in the first chapter, I can only use words like abracadabra, banana, bat, cat, mat. And that's my limited repertoire. And I do it for each of the 5 vowels. I tell 5 stories that are constrained by this really strict rule. And the challenge, of course, is to produce something that makes sense, but also sounds unlabored, sounds natural and lovely, has some poetic musicality to it. It took me 7 years to write it. I had to read through the dictionary 5 times by hand. The 3-volume, Third Webster's International New Dictionary. It has over 1 million entries. I had to read through it 5 times by hand, transcribing every single word that I could find that had only one vowel. And then I proceed to use up that vocabulary. Nearly 99% of the vocabulary gets used. There's a few words that don't get into the book. I'm a little disappointed that there are a handful of words that escaped this lobster trap.
Word? Do you remember?
In chapter I couldn't use the word gingivitis.
Which means?
It's a gum disease, that you get in your mouth. Gingivitis. I couldn't use the word belvedere, a beautiful word for a balcony. I couldn't use the word tumulus. I could not somehow incorporate some of these words.
Did you like working on this project? Or
Oh
was it
no,
also
it was a
hard
terrible
labor?
project. It was terrible. Oh God, it was terrible.
Why did you impose yourself?
Oh, the memory of it,
I mean-
it stings. 7 years of work, and most of it was, I was very depressed. It was difficult. I would be working 8 hours a day, and I'd come home and I'd have to, work on other projects like my dissertation at school. But midnight, I'd begin working on this project until 3 or 4 in the morning. Each one of those little paragraphs is about 3 or 4 months worth of work. So that poem I read to you took about 4 months to compose. All of the work that I do is typically labor intensive. It's pretty onerous. I'm known as the poet who does impossible things. It looked impossible, and yet nobody had really put this particular constraint to the test. I did it because
it looked impossible?
Exactly. Nobody had attempted to see whether or not it was really conceivable to write according to this constraint. Lots of poets had imagined doing it. There had been, in the history of literature, poets fantasizing that they might like to try this experiment, but nobody had ever really put it to the test. The assumption, of course, was that it was too difficult. I can see why nobody would put it to the test. It is, in fact, too difficult to imagine doing. But I'm grateful it made the effort. It went on to become a much more famous book than I would have ever expected. It became an international bestseller and established my career.
Can you explain? I mean, I think in Holland, a book with poems like these, I must say that in Dutch, there are translated into Dutch, and I really admire the translator who did it.
Yeah, the translator's brilliant. I have to say, read his books, not mine. He's obviously an extraordinary talent.
But what I wanted to say is, I think in Holland you would only sell maybe 500 copies. What do you think made this book so popular in Canada?
I actually do not know. I have to say that I'm an experimental poet. The work I do is very abstruse. It has a highly limited audience. I would have expected this book to be read by me and maybe a few hundred of my friends at most. But the book has sold tens of thousands of copies around the world. It's 50, 60,000 copies have been sold now. That's not a lot of books, I suppose, in the grand scheme of things, but certainly in the world of poetry, it's a lot.
A world of experimental poetry.
And certainly among experimental poets, this would be an impossible feat.
Is it translated into other languages besides Dutch, as you know?
There have been excerpts translated into other languages, into French and Dutch, of course. There are a handful of people who've dallied with these constraints in an effort to, I guess, showcase some element of the work, to provide a bit of a taste to other speakers. I would think that the proper translation of this work would simply be to do your own linguistic version of it in your own language. Right? Just respond to your own limited lexicon and try to exhaust its potential completely. That would be a perfectly adequate translation. What I think impresses me about Hans' translation is that he actually preserves the content of the work as well. It's not just written according to the univocalic lipogram, that constraint. It's also conveys the original meaning of the work.
Yeah, you had to do some adjustments. For instance, in your poem, with only E, he uses a she instead of he.
Sure, I mean, that would be a perfectly legitimate adjustment to make, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Let's step over to one of your other, most famous, I don't know, is it famous, your Xenotext project?
Oh yeah, that would be the next largest project that has dominated my life now for the better part of 20 years. I've been working on this project exclusively now for 20 years.
20 years.
Almost, yeah.
Because we started with Lego, then we had the vocals, and now we're going to the bacteria and the DNA. Because according to Mr. Book, we can also make poetry from DNA. Maybe you can explain to the audience how one can make
I hope that I won't bore you over the next minute or two. I will do my best to summarize a complex project very quickly. I've written a poem, a very short poem, and then through a process...
Do you remember the poem? Of course you remember.
Not in its entirety. The opening line of the poem begins, any style of life is prim. It's a very short little sonnet, and I've written this poem in such a way that it can be enciphered into a sequence of DNA, into a genetic sequence. And then with the assistance of a laboratory, I actually build that gene in the lab and then implant it into the genome of a bacterium, replacing part of its genetic code with my poem. so that now the organism is the living embodiment of that text. Now, should note that lots of artists and scientists have enciphered information of this sort into the genomes of organisms, and if that's all I wanted to do, I could have finished this project 18 years ago. But my intention, nobody else has ever tried to do this, was to get the organism to respond. So I've written the poem in such a way that when it's translated into this gene, the organism can actually read that genetic sequence and understand it.
Did you get any help by writing it?
I had to learn how to become a genetic engineer and a proteomic engineer, a protein engineer, all on my own. I'm responsible for designing the experiments. The laboratories assist me in making things and testing things, but they are not responsible for designing it. I had to come up with the genetic designs and the protein designs myself.
So that even took you a few years of study, I think.
It took at least 4 years. It took me 4 years of training just to acquire the skill set required to begin. So that was my first step, was acquiring a sufficient skill set to do this project and propose it. The outcome, though, is that the organism would read the gene, and in response, it's capable of building a protein, and that protein consists of a sequence of amino acids, its sequence of molecules, encipher a totally different poem that also makes sense. So I've engineered a bacterium, so it becomes not only an archive for storing my poem, it becomes a machine for writing a poem in response. And as crazy as that might sound, the punchline is that the target organism for this project, I've managed to get it to work in a colony of E. coli as a way of demonstrating that I know what I'm doing. But the target is to put it into a bacterium that's capable of surviving in all kinds of hostile environments. You can scorch it, freeze it, wither it, and it won't die. This organism can repair its own DNA so quickly that it does not mutate or evolve. It's an evolutionary dead end. But it is already so well adapted to the lethality of the universe that it does not need to change. It can survive in the open vacuum of outer space. It can survive 1,000 times the dosage of gamma radiation that would instantly kill a human being. We don't know what the natural habitat of this organism is because you can find it anywhere on the planet. And some scientists have speculated that it must have spent at least part of its evolutionary history in outer space in order to have acquired these immunities. By putting my poem into this bacterium, I'd be writing a book that might conceivably outlast terrestrial civilization, and it could be on the planet Earth when the sun explodes. I'm trying to write a book of poetry that lasts forever.
Is it
That's my project.
But you have written it, right? I mean,
I have written
it.
These two poems, they do exist. I've managed to get it to work in an actual bacterium. I'm the first poet in history to design a text that will cause an organism to write a text in response. I've been interviewed in Nature magazine. I'm the first poet in the history of that magazine to appear in the pages of Science of Nature magazine. I've been touring the world, addressing scientists and billionaires about this project. I've addressed people at Google. I've talked to people at MIT. It's a long-term, ongoing project that is still in progress. I'm still trying to get it to function properly in the organism. I have a couple of benchmarks that I have to meet that I haven't been able to quite to successfully met, and the consequence of which is I can't say as an artist that I've been successful at the project. So I've got some very strict criteria by which I might judge my own success. And in the meantime, I'm working on poetry that's designed to support this project, and I'm constantly trying to find money to make sure that I can continue to do the experiments.
Yeah, because that would be my last question. If you have such a project, your poetry will outlast long after you're gone. What more can you wish as a poet? What more is there?
I would like to become a multimillionaire. I'm surprised that somebody with my big brain isn't. There's lots of. But
as a poet,
I'm always aspiring to do things that would be challenging. In the world of poetry, I think failure is always presumed. I'd like to be a success. I'd like to try things that are very difficult. And I'm trying to respond, I think, to the socio-technological circumstances of my life as a poet in the 21st century. I have many misgivings about what poetry does right now in the 21st century, because I think it ignores many of the most important features of our culture. I think it's understandable that it does, but in this particular case, this is an attempt on my part to speak directly to important scientific advancements and to provide permission to other poets to undertake similar kinds of ambitious projects.
Yeah, because I read somewhere you were hoping that there would be more or that DNA might be the language of poetry of the future, but that.
Well, I think that undoubtedly DNA will be used as a means of storing information. It already is. It's a very durable way of storing information. One of the most amazing features of DNA is that it can transmit information across epochal time. We know of no way by which we might preserve our cultural legacy for more than a few million years. And yet, in your bodies, there are information that are so crucial to your survival that they have been transmitted through time for billions of years. Living things are an immense repository of durable information. And I believe that it's important for us to imagine trying to preserve our cultural legacy against, disasters, meteoric impacts, nuclear warfare.
But who's there to enjoy the culture if there's...
Well, you hope that it's our survivors or our descendants who might be able to reconstitute that culture. But our current legacy into the future, the stuff that we leave behind that might be perceived 100 million years from now, they're not great things. I mean, every city, all of our achievements would be ground into an almost undetectable layer of geological sediment. But the things that would be preserved and detectable for a civilization that came to discover us would include the background radiation from our nuclear waste, the fossil record preserving the current sixth extinction, mass extinction that we're causing, and of course all of the environmental effects of climate change caused by fossil fuel burning. All of that would be preserved for hundreds of millions of years. That's not a great legacy in the future. I would prefer that it be the theory of relativity or a concerto by Mozart or something.
Yeah, well, I think we have to leave with
yes,
that.
Yes, you've been very gracious. Thank you so much for your indulgences.
I also
appreciate
hope it will be the Mozart.
Cheers.
And
you've been very gracious. I appreciate it.
I'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Buck. En zoals u allemaal hebt gemerkt... valt er over het werk van Mr. Buck nog veel te... Het is erg interessant om nog even naar te luisteren. En dat kan vanavond ook hier nog in deze zaal. Om 8:00 zal hij veel meer voor u lezen. Dank u wel, Mr. Buck. Eventjes, ik hoorde net ergens een telefoon. Willen jullie allemaal je telefoon misschien op stil zetten? Dat zou fijn zijn. Then now I'd like to invite to the stage Mr. Alí Calderón from Mexico and Miss Dolores Dorantes. Would you like some water? Bienvenido.
Thank you.
Mr. Calderón, Miss Dorantes? Yeah.
Still.
Welcome. Mr. Calderón, he's a poet. He edited a number of anthologies of Mexican and Latin American literature, but also international poetry. He teaches Mexican literature, and he's the director of the Mexico City International Poetry Festival, and he's also co-founder of an online poetry magazine called Círculo de Poesía, right? And Ms. Dorantes is a poet, a storyteller, an activist, journalist, even a Buddhist priest, if I'm correctly informed. And apart from that, she also stimulates women in marginal positions to write their story. Do you know each other's work?
Work?
Yeah, your work?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, of course. I read her poetry since a lot of years ago, like 10 years ago.
Yes, he was a kid and he read my work. Yeah, but Ali is a very well-known poet in Mexico, and yes, of course, I've been read his work. And I know him by name, but not. It's the first time that
we met here.
Yeah,
we met here.
You met here?
Yeah.
So okay.
I'm celebrating that.
We're living like 2,000 kilometers
Yeah, far
away.
away. Yes.
Mr. Calderón, I'd like to start with you.
Yes.
You teach Mexican literature. You have a lot of positions in the Mexican literary field. I'd like to know, do you think, is there such a thing as Mexican poetry? Are there any specifics? No?
No, no more. We
No
have
more, you say?
We have a big problem with that label. What's Mexican? When should we start talking about Mexican? Talking about the king poet Nezahualcóyotl in the pre-Hispanic times.
Mm-hmm.
Is that Mexican? The Popol Vuh is Mexican? Or, I don't know, Sor Juana, the most important writer on the 16th century, is she Mexican? Or is she Spaniard? I don't know. The first Mexican poet was living on the first days on the 19th century. Is that already Mexico? Where is to be a Mexican? I don't know.
You don't know.
That's a big problem of identity.
Yeah, that's a real problem in literature in Mexico?
Yeah, absolutely. But now I think it's even most difficult, because I think to say Mexican literature, Colombian literature, Argentinian literature is so small. We speak a language of 500 million people. So I think the most accurate word to define the poetry in my language is the label Pan-Hispanic. Pan-Hispanic is Spaniards, Argentinians, people from Nicaragua, Mexicans living in Canada or in the States, and Mexicans, well, our language, yeah.
Well, I also asked this question because somewhere, I think in an interview it was it that you said that Mexico is a country in which literature is bolstered. Bolstered, so it's how should I say? So there are many. You can get a lot of grants as a writer.
Yes.
But if you write too critical, then then you're out.
All right.
So you get a kind of a brave poetry and not a too critical poetry.
In Mexico, the government pays a lot of money to culture, gives a lot of money to poets to write, no? A lot of money, no? So if you are too critical, of course, they are not giving you the grant. So a lot of people has a problem with being a critic. Yeah, it happens. It's like we said, we have a word, paternalist state. No? Yeah. And I think it's a problem for literature. A problem and not a problem.
For each culture, you say? Or is it a problem for each culture or specific
No, for Mexico.
Yeah.
Mexico. For example, Mexico gives grants for young writers, but also for writers from 35 years and older. A lot of money to be living in Mexico, right? So
you're laughing?
Yes.
Yeah. How much money is it then?
No. I think that it for poetry is never a lot of money.
No,
of course,
I'm fine with
of course.
I don't have problem with that.
No, but it has a problem. It has a problem because the government and elite controls everything. Mm-hmm. So that's a big problem.
And what do you do in your poetry to avoid
to create new spaces? To create new spaces, new festivals, new readings, to read people from abroad, to teach poetry to young kids.
But in your
to create an audience.
In your own writing, I mean, you sound as if you are a critical person. But how do you look for the space in your own work? I mean, you travel a lot, for instance. Is it also a kind of way to free yourself from?
Okay. For example, I understand. In Mexico, we have 50 million people living with $1 per day.
50 or 50?
50.
Yeah.
50 million. 50 million.
$1. Yeah.
$1. What can you buy with $1? We have had this war against the drug cartels with 200,000 deaths,
Yeah.
and 25,000 people disappearing, and a lot of feminicides, and a lot of corruption and corrupted elections. So how is gonna answer the poetry? How are we gonna tell the reality? I'm gonna tell you one story.
Yeah.
And I'm so sorry to tell the story to you, but I'm gonna. The idea is to show or not to show what is happening. For example, I saw in the news the image of a feminicide. It totally broke me down.
Feminicide.
Feminicide.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know if everybody...
Woman being killed.
Yeah, woman being killed. Yeah. It's not.
So I saw the image. It was on Mexico City, on a neighborhood in Mexico City. The name of the place is Chimalhuacan. So the image was so hard. She was the woman, the jeans, one leg with the jeans, the other leg, no pants, no flesh, just bone, the bone. It was on the news. Everybody was looking at that, the kids, everybody was looking at that. So we think, what about the victims? The victim dignity we were talking about the other day. What about the victim's dignity? In the other hand, should poetry try to answer to this reality or no?
What do you think?
Or how? I think yes.
You think yes?
I think yes.
Yes?
We should try to discover a language to talk about this. Discover, try, experiment, explore, try to go beyond some devices. I think we have to talk about this, absolutely.
Is that maybe, Mr. Dorantes, because you don't live in Mexico anymore? You criticize the government and for the things that they didn't do anything, or at least not enough about the things that Mr. Calderón just told us about. You had to leave your own country for being critical about it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was for that reason specifically, because I really don't know. I just need to flee to save my life.
Yeah.
That's the fact. I can, figuring out why somebody trying to kill me, right? But I'm not sure. I'm not sure why. But I've been doing some work. I have a column in the national newspaper, a political column at that time.
Yeah.
I've been working with women in marginal sides of the Ciudad Juárez. It was where the war started.
Yeah.
And I don't believe that the war in Mexico was a product of drug cartels. Right, so I write about that, and somebody tried to kill me, so I flee the country. That's the only fact, right? We can talk about. So, yeah. And what was the question?
Well, I wanted to ask because you say Mr. Calderón said we have to find ways in poetry to write about it, and I think about is maybe not exactly the right word, but I think maybe you found a way. Can I read at least the work I read from you? I think you.
Mm. Yeah, well, because I write about what experience. What is my experience? This is it. I've been living for 25 years in the border of Mexico, in the city who started with the war terror against people. That's my experience. It's not that I think that everybody needs to talk about it, right? I believe in freedom. So I think that everybody needs to write of whatever they want, right? I write about the conflict because it was my experience. I've been there when that's happened.
Yeah.
I've been, living in shock for 25 years, and also working with the newspapers, with photographers, with the researchers, and so on. So that's my experience.
Yeah, but maybe I can explain about the work I read from you from Copia.
Yes.
And your translator said about this work that it's she suggests escaping and disappearing from a country, the withdrawal from everyday life, fitting into a new structure, and wanting to be free. But the form of the work, I have a lot of paper here, is very, it's almost formal, right? I mean, you have this part of a dictionary, and here you have some kind of a quote that if you read it, you think it could be from a management book or something like that.
It's academic.
Yeah.
It's a academic part of.
Yeah, and the tone of voice of the prose poems, if I may call them that way, it's almost impersonal. Beside that, you feel a lot of. It's an impersonal tone as to hold the things beneath the pain and the anger together. Maybe you can read just a few sentences so that you get an impression of the.
You tell me what the. Just the beginning.
Yeah, this small part is enough. Just the impression.
Se vuelve cada vez más tenue. La capacidad de compasión. El cumplimiento del deber es el motivo de la vida, bajo presión social. La línea de la responsabilidad personal se vuelve cada vez más tenue. Escapar de la responsabilidad. Escapar de la responsabilidad a través del cumplimiento del deber. Someterse. Tú eres tú y cada vez más tenue. En gran copia, escapar de la compasión.
Thank you. But can you explain why you use this form, this almost impersonal?
This book is called Copy, and I use all the copy process that I can find to this is my first conceptual book.
Okay.
So I start with a photograph of a dictionary with the meanings and all that. But I need to be the photograph there, because the photograph is a copy process. It's not just quote the dictionary. It's also put the photograph of the dictionary there to being aware of the copy process. But talking about copy process, even so, it's a condition for us to be alive, genetically speaking. It's boring. So I prefer to say that the tone, I was using repetition, because every word that starts with the prefix re means some copy process there. So I use repetition in the format of my structure, of my language structure. And but I also I'm talking about the misunderstanding between responsibility and duty. So in our daily life, we misunderstand duty with responsibility. So we used to live like that, right? So, and we think we just say, well, my boss tell me to do it, right? And I'm responsible because I have my check. And I do what my boss wants. But no, it's my duty, but I'm not being responsible, right? And so we live like that. We mistake responsibility with duty. And also we mistake love for power. So in our daily life, we exchange love for power. If you behave as I want, I love you. If you don't behave as I want, I don't love you anymore. So that's love or is power. I want power over you in our daily life. And we used to do that day after day after day. And that repetition create global behavior. So we criticize a lot what is happening now. The power put our foot on us, right, all the time. But we do this every time, even with our child. If you behave, I love you. If you don't behave, I don't love you anymore, right? So, yeah, that's the main point of the book,
But
I think.
The words you copied from the Spanish dictionary aren't just any words.
No.
They
I
have
choose the
specific,
meaning. I choose the meaning, and if
for instance?
of course, it's a very conscious process. I work a lot. I do a research a lot. The quote is from from a researcher, Ariel Bercelli. He's an Argentinian specialist in copyright and copy process in any sense. It's people who are putting their lives researching on the copy process. So yeah, I make a huge research, and that's the result of my obsession, basically.
Yeah, would you call it an obsession?
Yeah, totally. Yes. But it's not just about me, right?
No.
But yeah, I put order in my obsession to live for others. I don't live just for me. For me, live just for me, it doesn't make sense to me anymore. So I live for others. That's why I'm a priest of the Mahajriya Buddhist tradition. I don't live only for me.
Is that also why you work a lot with women?
It's not the main reason, but now I'm more conscious of that. I always want to be, a functional part of society. And as a poet, you are out of the functional part of the society, right? So I use my poetry because I need it. I feel good when I write. And I do something always on a side, right? And I like to serve others. And I don't like just to think that I'm the center of the world. And we are just too little, right? So if I connect with others, I can have a huge impact, I guess. So, yeah, I do that.
Is your writing, has it changed since you're surrounded by English as a language instead of Spanish?
No.
Did it affect your writing?
No, not at all. Not at all. I love Spanish, but I love Nahuatl the most. Just what Ali says. What is to be a Mexican? So my heart is Nahuatl. Absolutely, it's the indigenous language of my heart, and the language that adopted me is Spanish. So I'm more in between that two, and English is a tool to everybody, right? Everybody uses as a tool, and a wonderful.
Yeah,
it's a wonderful screw.
Yeah, Mr. Calderón, it's almost. No, we have time still. You travel a lot, as you say, from the English to other countries. Can you say how this inspires your work? I mean, the first poems I read from you had titles like Constantinople or Sarajevo, Transiberiano.
Well, I think a poem is like a mental landscape or something like that. No? In first place, I like to travel to discover poets, to discover other sort of thinking. I don't know. I think that's the most important work of the festivals. You have here in Rotterdam one of the most important festivals of the world. So you have an idea of poetry. I'm interested in knowing what are you thinking on poetry. So I learned. When I went to one of the other magnificent festivals in Struga, I learned. But the same in Latin America. For example, I have a strange experience in Peru, a festival in Cusco, but not in Cusco City. It was on the mountains of Cusco, on 4,000 meters over the sea. And who was in the audience? The audience was Quechua kids. So we read poems
Quechua,
for Quechua kids.
It's an indigenous language.
Yeah, from Peru.
Yeah.
And it was strange because nobody understood. But it was kind of nice. Strange, really strange stuff happens in poetry.
So you don't have to, you say that you don't have to speak or even speak each other's language or understand each other's language just to, poetry can make sense in a different level.
Everything there was a little absurd. But so is poetry, so is life, so is life. But you learn stuff. You learn to know other people, to be aware that other people is living, other people is there, and you have to make them visible. To make them visible, I think one of the biggest problems of the poetry nowadays is that nobody reads nobody.
You think so?
Yeah, I think so. I've seen that. So I think that's very important for the festivals and for the poets to read not only their own tradition, but other traditions. No? I think it's very important to be contemporary of the poets of the world.
But can you tell us just in your own poems, how does it affect your language maybe, or the way you're writing? Having read so many, and having heard so many other poets.
I want to answer the last one.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm a Carl Jung's reader.
Sorry, you are?
Carl Jung's reader. Carl Gustav Jung. He says he has this idea that the environment, the objects around us, the people around us, is like a metaphor from ourselves. So the places we are always are saying something about us. No? You are here because you are a kind of metaphor of myself right now. And
that's interesting.
And what I try to do all the time is to think in this level. Carl Jung, talking about the unconscious, used to think this. So I think that...
Can you give me an example, a more concrete example of what you're
yes,
trying to explain right now?
Yes, of course. For example, you remember Freud in the interpretation of the dreams?
Yes.
He said, okay, we always are dreaming strange stuff, okay? But it's not strange. It has a meaning. How can you know the meaning of the dream? Okay, by association, by metaphor, everything by metaphor, as Aristotle said. So Jung and other people is saying, and what if we see actual life, real life, as a dream, a scene of life as a dream? So we could interpret our life as a dream. So
do you do that?
In some poems, yeah. It's it's some kind of surrealism, for example, no? That's the idea.
Do you have one of these poems in the selection for poetry? With the process you're
trying to do that.
Yeah.
Trying to do that. Well, I try to make the correspondence between the environment and the self. I think the most important I think the most important question for the contemporary poetry is to answer what I say when I say I. And for example, I don't think the poetry is neutral, or I think the I is always on the poetry, at least at constructive level, for example. No? So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's see about time. Oh, we have a few minutes more. There's one poem I'd like you to read for us, because it's a poem, when I read it for the first time, it made me silent. And since we started this small conversation about Mexico, I'd like to ask you to read for us Democracia Mexicana.
We're having elections in 1 month.
Real elections or?
Real. It seems so. It seems so. Real. I hope. I said, in 200 years of independent life, we have had democracy twice. Twice. Very good. For 10 seconds. Democracia mexicana. Otro cadáver encontrado en una bolsa negra. Cerca de ahí, un cuerpo, el viento, un puente. A 2 cuadras, una cabeza hirsuta, ojos abiertos. Entre otras noticias, 30 ejecutados el fin de semana, tiro de gracia, algunos con marcas de tortura, el rescate fallido de un secuestro, un dedo, un anillo, un hato de periódico. Entre otras noticias, terminaron e iniciaron las campañas. Hay buena voluntad en Washington, la reforma migratoria. Este bimestre se abate en un punto la pobreza, el bienestar, la dicha. A lo lejos, el escape de un camión y después el silencio. Abren la bolsa negra. El hedor, el moho en la carne. Una recién nacida.
Omdat ik niet weet hoeveel van u er Spaans spreken, I'll read the poem in Dutch. Ik kan het niet zo mooi als Mr. Calderón, maar ik doe mijn best. Mexicaanse democratie. Nog een lijk gevonden in een zwarte zak. Vlakbij een lichaam, de wind, een brug. 2 straten verder. Een borstelig hoofd. Open ogen, in het nieuws. 30 man geëxecuteerd in het weekend. Genadeschot. Sommigen met sporen van marteling. Mislukte bevrijdingsactie na ontvoering. Een vinger, een ring, een rolletje krant. In het nieuws. De campagnes zijn geëindigd en begonnen. Er is goede wil in Washington. De migratiehervorming de afgelopen maanden zien we een daling van 1 punt in armoede. Welzijn, geluk. In de verte de uitlaat van een vrachtwagen. Daarna stilte. Ze openen de zwarte zak, de stank, het beschimmelde vlees. Een pasgeboren meisje. I think it's a very heartbreaking poem. It's a very hard poem as well. You just told us about the things you saw on television. How do Mexican readers respond to a poem like this?
We have a lot of good poets talking about their experience of violence. A lot of poets. Sara Uribe, for example, is a wonderful poet talking about this. And Balam Rodrigo, another important poet in Mexico, young poet, is talking about, for example, the strange and hard travel of the Central American people crossing through Mexico to get into the States. So it is difficult to get into the States. It's more difficult cross by Mexico because Mexico is awful with them. So there's a lot of people looking for the language to describe the experience. No? For example, in the this story. Hear this story. 3 years ago, we don't know why, but the army or the cops or the drug cartels or somebody killed 43 students, teachers. They were students to be teachers, and on the countryside in Guerrero, in Ayotzinapa. Maybe you have heard that name. 43 guys dead. One of them, he was the head, the skin of the head was removed. We all saw that image, you remember? And so how to speak about this? So one Mexican poet, Mario Bojorquez, tried to write the story combining the facts with the Aztec mythology. So there's a possibility. What I mean is that the Mexican poets, the Latin American poets, because Colombians and people from El Salvador are looking for the language to explain their reality, their own experience of violence. So we're looking. I think that actual poetry in Latin America is so alive. A lot of people is writing and reading poetry. This is the best moment of poetry ever. So we're trying to write something.
So there are readers,
something
you
good.
say. I mean, because earlier you said I think one of the problems is we don't read each other, but there are readers.
The poets say that always are saying that they read, but they don't.
The poets don't read.
No, the poets don't read. But the kids
they do.
The guys are, people in universities are. There's a big vitality. Yeah.
Okay.
Vitality.
Mr. Calderón, Mr. Dorantes, I'd like to thank you very much for this very short conversation. So much better.